I was 22, a guy just trying to figure out life. College was behind me, I had a decent job, and I thought I knew who I was. But nothing could have prepared me for the bombshell that would drop just a few months later. And it all started one evening at a family gathering. Picture this, it was a Saturday night. My mom, dad, and I had gathered at my aunt's house, like we always did for family get-togethers. You know the type, awkward small talk, cousins running around, someone always arguing about politics. Typical family stuff. But that night felt different. There was a tension in the air I couldn't quite place. Then, he showed up. My Uncle Richard, always the life of the party, cracking jokes, telling wild stories. But there was something off about him that night. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at my mom or how he seemed to be forcing his usual laugh. He didn't look like the same guy I'd known for years. Now, Richard wasn't exactly the kind of guy you'd expect to have secrets. He was loud, brash, and, if I'm being honest, a little too comfortable in his own skin. He was the type of guy who always had a drink in his hand, who would give you the life advice you didn't ask for. But there was always this unspoken bond between us. After all, he was my uncle, and I trusted him like I trusted my own dad. But something changed that night. It all started innocently enough. My mom and dad were off talking to my aunt in the kitchen, and I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone. Richard walked up to me with one of his signature half-smirks. He looked at me for a long second, almost as if he was sizing me up, before saying, "You ever wonder how different your life would be if things had played out a little differently?" I laughed it off. Classic Richard. But the look in his eyes, it wasn't the same. There was this intensity, this weight, like he was trying to communicate something without saying the words. "Seriously, man," he went on, sitting down next to me. "You ever think about how small changes can change everything?" I wasn't sure what he was getting at, but I gave a half-hearted shrug. I guess, like, if I'd taken a different path in life or, like, dated someone else in high school? Richard shook his head, his eyes flicking to my mom and dad in the kitchen, then back to me. "Nah, not like that. I mean, think about the big stuff. The real stuff. The things no one talks about." At this point, I was starting to get uncomfortable. What was he talking about? What could possibly be so big and so secretive that he was bringing it up now, of all times? "Richard, what the hell are you talking about?" I asked, trying to mask the tension creeping up my spine. He just stared at me for a moment, then chuckled. It was one of those laughs that didn't quite reach his eyes. He leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice. "You ever wonder about your dad?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad? What the hell was he implying? Before I could respond, my mom and dad came back into the room, and Richard stood up, patting me on the back in that way he always did when he wanted to brush something off. "Just messing with you, kid," he said, his voice too light, too casual. "I'm sure everything's fine." But I couldn't shake it. The look in his eyes, the cryptic comment, it lingered in my mind long after that night. And when I tried to talk to my mom about it later, she brushed me off with one of those "it's nothing, don't worry about it" lines. But I knew. I knew something wasn't right. Something about Richard, about my family, was off. And that was just the beginning. I didn't know it yet, but that seemingly casual conversation would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, about my identity, and about the man I called my father. Something hidden in plain sight had been waiting for years to surface. And when it did, it changed everything. I couldn't stop thinking about Richard's words. It was like a crack in the foundation of everything I'd ever known, and the more I thought about it, the wider the crack got. I had to know what he meant. I had to understand why he had said what he did. But I didn't know how to ask. I mean, how do you even start a conversation like that? "Hey, Mom, Is there something you haven't told me about Uncle Richard? It sounded ridiculous, like I was trying to piece together some sort of soap opera. But that's exactly how it felt, like I'd stumbled into some twisted family drama I wasn't supposed to be part of. The problem was, my gut told me this wasn't just some misstep in conversation. Richard was hiding something. And it felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and if I stepped forward, everything would come crashing down. I spent days trying to push the thoughts aside. Life, work, all of it, it was easier to bury myself in the mundane. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just under the surface. Every time I saw my mom or my dad, I kept wondering, what are you not telling me? And then, one evening, I got the call. It was Richard. His voice was low, almost urgent. You need to come over. We need to talk. A knot formed in my stomach. There was no way I could ignore it now. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. I showed up at his house that night, my heart pounding in my chest. Richard's place was cozy, as usual. He'd always kept things laid back, nothing too fancy, but everything seemed different tonight. Even the air in the room felt heavier. Richard was sitting on his couch, looking like he hadn't slept in days. The usual easygoing, cocky uncle I'd known for years was gone. In his place was someone else, someone who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Sit down, kid, Richard said, motioning to the seat across from him. There was a certain tension in his voice that I couldn't ignore. I sat down, unsure of what was about to happen. He didn't say anything for a long while, just stared at the floor. His hands were gripping the sides of the couch, like he was holding onto something, anything, to stop from falling apart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard spoke. I wasn't just messing with you that night. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and real. I could barely breathe, like my lungs had forgotten how to work. You are my son, he said, voice barely a whisper. It took a moment for the words to even register. I blinked, sure I'd heard him wrong. What? What are you talking about? Richard's eyes were full of pain, and something else I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. I never wanted to tell you like this. It was always supposed to stay a secret. But now, it's too late. You deserve to know the truth. I'm your father, not your uncle. Your dad, he's not who you think he is. My brain struggled to make sense of it. My mouth went dry. No, I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. That doesn't make sense. You're my uncle. My real dad is. I am your father, Richard repeated, his voice shaking now. I don't even know where to begin. It was a long time ago, before your mom married him. I don't expect you to understand, but I was there, I was with your mom, and I never told anyone. I thought I could keep it buried forever, but it wasn't fair to you. You deserve the truth. The room seemed to close in on me. I felt like I was drowning in his words. Every single thing I thought I knew about my life, my family, my identity, was flipping upside down. I had no idea how to even begin to process this. I stood up suddenly, as if I could escape the suffocating weight of the truth. This can't be real. You're lying. My mom, she'd never. Richard's eyes were full of sorrow. She never knew I was going to tell you. She's been carrying this too. You don't think she had a choice in all this? We both did things we shouldn't have, and now it's all come crashing down. I took a step back. My world was falling apart. My head was spinning, and I couldn't even think straight. How could you keep something like this from me? I shouted, more to myself than him. Why would you let me grow up thinking you were just my uncle? Richard's face crumpled, like every ounce of guilt in him was weighing him down. I was a coward. I couldn't face the consequences of telling you. It wasn't just about me. Your mom, your dad, they couldn't know. It would have ruined everything. But I can't live with this lie anymore. You deserve to know. And just like that, everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, it wasn't real. I felt like I was standing in a field of shattered glass, every reflection of myself distorted, broken, and unrecognizable. The ground beneath me felt unstable, and I didn't know which direction to go in anymore. Could I trust Richard? Could I ever look at my mom or dad the same way again? And the biggest question of all, who the hell was I? I left Richard's house that night with more questions than answers. I didn't know where to go or who to talk to. My mind was a mess, racing from thought to thought, all of them colliding in some chaotic swirl. How could he do this? How could he keep something like this from me for so long? The drive home was a blur. I barely even remembered the road or the turns I made to get back. All I could think about was what Richard had told me. He's your father. It felt like the kind of thing you hear in some wild soap opera, not something that could actually happen to you. But here I was. My entire life had just been turned upside down. When I got home, my mom was in the kitchen, like she always was when I came back late. She was chopping vegetables, humming under her breath like she didn't have a care in the world. I stood there in the doorway, frozen. She had no idea that everything I thought I knew about her, about our family, was a lie. I didn't know how to start. How do you even begin a conversation like this? Hey, Mom, I just found out my uncle's actually my dad, and my whole life has been a lie. Cool, right? Yeah, that would go well. So I did what anyone would do when faced with a truth that heavy. I sat down and stared at my phone. I couldn't even bring myself to look at her. The tension between us was suffocating. After a few minutes of awkward silence, she sighed and wiped her hands on a dish towel. You okay? She asked, glancing over at me. You look like you've seen a ghost. Seen a ghost? If only. What I'd seen was a life-altering revelation that I had no idea how to process. My throat felt tight. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to talk. Her eyes narrowed, just a little. It was like she could feel something was wrong, but I wasn't about to drop the bomb on her just yet. About what? About Richard, I said. My voice felt like a whisper, like I didn't have the strength to say his name any louder. I still couldn't wrap my head around it. What did he mean? Why did he say that? My mom froze, her face going completely blank. The knife she had been using to chop the vegetables was suddenly still in her hand. Her grip tightened, but she didn't say anything. I knew she was processing what I'd said, trying to figure out if I had actually heard him right. Mom, I tried again, my voice shaking now. What's going on? Is it true? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the knife down carefully and turned toward me. Her face looked older all of a sudden, like she'd aged 10 years in the span of a few seconds. It's complicated, she said, her voice quiet. It's a lot more complicated than you think. Complicated? I repeated. What do you mean complicated? Richard, he said he's my dad, not him. I couldn't stop myself. The words spilled out like water, rushing faster than I could catch them. Is it true? Is he my father? She closed her eyes, and for a second, I thought she might cry. I never wanted you to know this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was supposed to be a secret. I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. What was supposed to be a secret? I demanded. What does that mean? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you? She cut me off, her voice suddenly firm, almost like she was trying to steady herself. Because I didn't want you to hate me. Her eyes were filled with something I couldn't identify, fear, guilt, shame, all tangled together. You were a baby, and I thought it was best for you to grow up with a father who loved you. Wait, I said, stumbling over my words. So you and Richard? Your father and I, she interrupted. Your real father. We made a mistake. A huge mistake. I wasn't prepared for what happened, and I couldn't deal with it. I married your dad soon after, and we both agreed to keep it a secret. We thought it was for the best. I sat back in my chair, trying to process what she was saying. Richard wasn't just my uncle. He was my dad. And my real dad? My biological father? He had no idea. I had to keep up appearances, she continued, her voice trembling now. For the sake of the family, for you, for everything. Richard didn't want anyone to know. We both thought that if we just stayed quiet, we could move on. But it was a lie, and it's been eating me alive. I couldn't keep hiding it from you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a secret, it was a massive betrayal. My whole life had been a lie, and the worst part? I didn't even know who to trust anymore. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell, to scream, to demand answers. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, wanted to protect her, to shield her from the consequences of her actions. I don't know what to do with this, I said finally. My voice was barely audible now, the weight of everything crashing down on me. How could you keep this from me? All these years, all the lies. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to me, but I pulled back instinctively. I wasn't ready for comfort, not yet. I needed to figure this out on my own. I didn't want you to hate me, she whispered again. I never wanted this for you. But the thing was, I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. The days after that conversation with my mom were a blur. I didn't know how to face her, or Richard, or even myself. Everything felt like a twisted version of reality, like I was looking at my life through a broken mirror, and every reflection was distorted. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's face, heard his voice telling me he was my father, and I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run away. I didn't talk to my mom for days. She tried reaching out, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. How could I? How could I look her in the eyes after she kept this from me for so long? I didn't want to hear her explanations or excuses. I didn't want to hear anything. But as much as I wanted to hate her, as much as I wanted to shove everything aside and pretend none of it was real, I knew I had to face it. I had to talk to Richard. I had to understand why he did this, why he kept this secret when it was clear it was eating him alive. So, one night, I called him. My hands were shaking as I dialed his number, but I had to do this. I couldn't let this fester any longer. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was flat, almost guarded. It's you. I need to talk, I said, my voice tight. Where are you? Same place, he replied. Come over. I hung up, not even waiting for him to say anything else. I didn't want to talk to him over the phone. I didn't want to hear anything that could be misunderstood. I had to look him in the eyes, see his face, feel the weight of his words in the same room. When I arrived at his place, he was sitting in the same chair I'd seen him in the night he told me everything. He looked different now, though older, worn out. There was no easy smirk, no wisecracks. His face was all business now, like he knew the gravity of the situation. Sit down, he said, motioning toward the chair across from him. I did, my heart pounding. The air between us felt thick, suffocating. I didn't even know where to start. Where do you begin when everything you thought you knew is suddenly a lie? I don't even know how to start with this, I said finally. You, my father, you've been lying to me for years." Richard didn't flinch. He just looked at me, his eyes tired. "I wasn't lying to you, kid. I was protecting you. I thought I was doing what was best for you. For everyone." "Protecting me? By lying to me?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. "How is that protecting me? You've ruined everything. My whole life, Richard. My family has been a lie. You think you were protecting me by keeping the secret?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked away, like he was searching for the right words, or maybe just avoiding my gaze. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said after a long pause. "I didn't want it to be like this." I leaned forward, frustration building. "Then what was the plan? To keep this secret forever? To just never tell me?" "No," he said softly, his voice almost regretful. "I wanted to tell you. I tried. But your mom, she wouldn't let me. She said it was too late, that you were better off not knowing. And then, by the time you were older, it was too late. The damage was done." I could feel my blood boiling. "So what, you just let me grow up thinking you were my uncle? Watching me call you Uncle Richard while I had no clue who you really were? You let me love you like that?" Richard's eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of pain. "It wasn't easy, believe me. It hurt me every damn day to watch you, knowing the truth and not being able to say a word. But your mom, she made me promise. She begged me to let it go. I couldn't break that promise, even though I knew it was tearing us all apart." I sat back in my chair, stunned by his words. Part of me wanted to explode, scream at him, but another part of me, a bigger part, felt a strange sort of pity. It wasn't just him who'd been carrying this weight. It was my mom too. And now, here I was, the one left with the wreckage. "I don't know what to say, man," I muttered, rubbing my forehead. "I don't even know who I am anymore. You're telling me that everything I thought I knew about my own family is a lie. And I'm supposed to just accept that?" Richard exhaled deeply, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "I get it. I do. You're angry, you're hurt, you feel betrayed. But you need to understand something. This wasn't just about you and me. This was about your mom too. She was in the middle of all of it, trying to protect you, trying to protect us all from the fallout. She was just as much a part of this as I was." "You're telling me that she knew? She knew you were my father?" The shock of it hit me like a freight train. "Yeah. She knew. And it killed her every day. But she didn't want you to grow up with the kind of chaos this would cause. She thought it was better to just leave it in the past." I felt like I was going to collapse. My mind couldn't process all this. I didn't know what to believe anymore. My whole world felt like it had just crumbled around me, and I was left standing in the rubble, trying to figure out where the hell I went wrong. It took a while, longer than I care to admit, for everything to settle in. Honestly, some days it still doesn't feel real. There's this weird weight, this constant reminder that I'm living in a world that doesn't make sense anymore. My whole life, I had this clear narrative. I was the son of my dad, raised by my mom, with an uncle who would always be the guy cracking jokes at the family barbecue. Simple, right? But now that picture is shattered, and I don't even know what the new version looks like. In the weeks that followed the night I spoke with Richard, things were tense. I won't lie to you, I felt like I was in free fall. I had no idea how to approach my mom, how to even begin to process everything. She and I finally talked, after I'd let enough time pass for both of us to breathe. We sat down, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw her as a person, not just my mom. She wasn't just the woman who raised me, she was someone who had made choices, painful choices, and was now living with the consequences. "I'm sorry," she said, and I could see how broken she was. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought it was better to keep things quiet. I thought I was protecting you." I tried to listen, really listen, but the anger was still there. I didn't know how to make peace with it. How could I? The betrayal felt too deep. But part of me understood, at least, I think I did. She wasn't trying to be malicious. She'd just been stuck between a rock and a hard place for so long that maybe she thought the only way out was to bury the truth. It wasn't an excuse, but it was something. And then there was Richard. Honestly, I didn't know what to make of him either. I couldn't just flip a switch and call him Dad after all those years of calling him my uncle. It didn't work that way. But we tried. We tried to find a way forward, even though it felt like I was still standing at the edge of a cliff, not knowing if I should jump or turn around. At first, the conversations with him were awkward. There was this constant, unspoken tension between us, like we were both trying to figure out what this new relationship even looked like. He'd always been the fun, goofy guy who showed up with the loud laugh and the wild stories, but now he was my dad, the person who had helped create me. It wasn't easy for either of us. But Richard kept showing up. He was there for me in ways that I never expected. And maybe, just maybe, that's when it started to click. I didn't have to forgive everything overnight. I didn't even know if I could. But I began to see that Richard wasn't a villain in this story. He was a man who had made mistakes, just like everyone else. A man who, despite everything, still wanted to be part of my life. And that meant something. It was the small things, really. Like when he'd call me up just to check in, or when he'd show up at my door with a 6-pack of beer, trying to make light of things, even though the air between us was heavy. I could see he was trying, and that made all the difference. And as for my mom, well, it took time. A lot of time. There were moments when I could feel the distance between us, the cracks in the foundation of our relationship that hadn't been there before. But slowly, over the months, I started to forgive her. Not because I was told to, but because I realized she was still the same woman who loved me, who raised me, and who, even in her mistakes, had never stopped wanting what was best for me. I started reaching out more, talking more. The silence between us wasn't as suffocating. I didn't know if things would ever be the same, but they didn't need to be. We were both just trying to figure out how to navigate this new reality. It's funny how life works. I used to think family was this simple thing, a unit built on trust, on shared memories, on unconditional love. But it's more complicated than that, isn't it? Families are messy. People make mistakes. Sometimes they do things they think are for the best, and other times, they just don't know any better. The truth, when it comes out, doesn't always come in a neat, pretty package. So where does that leave me? Honestly, I'm still figuring that out. I don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. There are still days when I feel the weight of the secret that was kept from me, days when the anger flares up again, or when I wonder if I'll ever truly be able to call Richard Dad without feeling like I'm betraying the life I had before. But one thing I do know? I'm not stuck. I'm not trapped in a past that doesn't fit. I'm moving forward. Maybe not perfectly, but I'm learning to live with the pieces of my past, however shattered they might be. And as for my family? Well, we're still here. We're still trying. The love isn't gone. It's just different. And sometimes, different is enough. It has to be.